Hello, my name is Ryan Matson. Welcome to the podcast. This podcast pertains to a trip that I and some fellow students from the University of Wisconsin Green Bay took over the course of this past summer to the country of Denmark. Now, we went to Denmark with the idea of studying history in the ways that it's portrayed to the public, especially the Danish public, and how the Danish people perceive and value their own history. Well, there we had the opportunity of witnessing a variety of different ways that history is presented. In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about how history is shown through reenactment, and it's sometimes referred to as living history through interpreters and reenactors wearing the clothes of the period and trying to replicate processes of the period in order to better engage the public and make it more available to a wider audience of people. Now, I will be talking about 4 of the places that we visited during this trip that deal particularly to reenactment and the way that it's, shown to the public. Now, the first one of these I'm going to talk about is the Mosgard Viking Moot. Now, the Mosgard Viking Moot takes place in Mosgard, Denmark, every year, and is the location of what probably is the largest Viking reenactment event that takes place in the entire world. Viking reenactors will come to this meeting, this moot, every year, and they all bring all of their best wares, they bring all of their best reenactment clothes, they bring all of their best everything. And this is kind of where the Viking reenactment community gets together, and they really get a chance to meet. I mean, there are people from all over the world. People, there are people there that are from Russia, from the United States, from Poland, Germany, you name it, and they're most likely there at the Viking Moot with representatives from all over the world. Now, the most fascinating thing about the Viking Moot is that the amount of activities that take place at the moot really make it very, very versatile. Like, an example would be they have scheduled reenactment battles where Viking reenactors who specialize in reenacting actual battles, they have their specific rules. They use real weapons that don't have sharpened edges on them, but they use real weapons, and it can get rather heated, and they will show the way that Vikings fought, various styles of clothing, of armaments, and all of these things are replicated to fit, the highest historical standards that, people can meet. And there are very high standards for many of these, not many, all of the apparel, the weapons, the jewelry. And you kind of see that, too, in the way that there are craftspeople at Mosgard. It is basically a collection of Viking-age tents, and there are stands with people selling jewelry, replica weapons, real weapons that craft people have made in the Viking historical style. You can find many things there. There are people there that they cook their own food in ancient ways. They brew their own mead. There's a variety of different activities that people can partake in when visiting the Mosgard Moot. I mean, there is what constitutes almost like a dance or beer hall. Trying to think of what a better term would be. It's almost like a gathering spot, not a dance or beer hall. But this is it's a place where everyone got together, and they had they can exchange stories, they can talk, they can discuss, they can enjoy food, beverages, and the atmosphere was very there's something very special about it. I thought the atmosphere was probably the most interesting thing about being there, because it's like you have all of these people who are in period clothes that are going about their business, and it's like they are completely delved into their Viking identities. And I found this to be incredibly interesting, and I really think that it's a very special thing, and especially because it only happens once a year and it's such a large gathering. I mean, and the fact that you can go there and take part in this thing almost from an outside perspective, to see this living historical reenactment and get a chance to be a part of it, I think is something that's very, very special to see. And actually, on the day that we went, it was the Mosgard Moot was almost rained out because there was such horrid rain that fell in Mosgard, and it was the roads or the paths around the tent city were so muddy that the people were shoveling sand on it to make them at least walkable. I found that to be really interesting, but the people who were at the Mosgard Moot, they couldn't seem to care less. I mean, it was definitely some of the activities had to be canceled for safety reasons because people couldn't find footing, but people were bound and determined to get as much reenacting done as they possibly could. And you could see this a lot with the people who would come to these events to sell their reenactment material. I know there was a particularly interesting man from Finland who created silver Viking jewelry by casting it himself and chiseling it by hand in order to make the most faithful replication of the process of the jewelry making. I mean, there were so many people here that are, they're there because they live and they breathe Viking reenactment, and it's a very, very cool way to see history portrayed in this way. And not only do I think it's something that's almost indescribable, as in there's not really any firm definition I can ascribe to it. There's something about having such an atmosphere, such a historical atmosphere, with people who have such passion for the era, and to see them be so active is something that I think really is a valuable way, because you get a much better perspective of, I would say, the feel of the time period during this way. I mean, you can read a book about it, but once you see it, I think it's you get a much more full perspective on such a time period. And this was one of the first living history reenactment sites that we visited while we were in Denmark, and it was really a very interesting way to start. I mean, we were rained on, and it was just fun. I mean, we were getting muddy, and it was a really good time. One of the other places that we visited that I would like to briefly talk about is the Ribe Viking Center. Now, this is located in Ribe, Denmark, and it is a reenactment park that you have to pay to get in. It is a park, but it also deals a lot more with very, very structured, authentic display of Viking material culture and Viking culture overall. The people who work at these places are both a combination of volunteers who do this in their spare time and a few full-time employees. Now, the people who work here, they will come to the park, they will dress in their garb, and they will basically go about their daily Viking Age tasks. And there are many tasks there, and there can be tasks going there from feeding horses and cattle and chickens to gathering water from a local stream for cooking, and basically a lot of aspects of everyday life. There is a blacksmith there. There are some farms. There are people spinning wool. Things that would go on in an everyday Viking village. These reenactors basically arrive in the morning, put on their garbs, and just start living life like the Vikings would. Now, this is a very, very interesting way to display this to the public, in my opinion, because it really puts the emphasis on interaction with the public. All these interactors, they're doing their everyday tasks, waiting for a visitor to come up and basically either ask them what they're doing or to ask if they can start helping or doing what they're doing. And there's plenty of times when we visited the park that I would go up to an interpreter and ask, what is this specific item? And I would not only get a response to what that item is, I would get an invitation to create an item similar or to learn the processes that were used in the creation of the item. Now, this really opens things up, especially for, I would say, a very, very wide audience of ages, because there are things that are being done here that appeal really to everyone from the age of a child to adulthood, because there are people who are doing crafts that could be used in everyday life today. They are doing things that are very that are very, they really appeal to children, such as feeding smaller animals, like learning a lot about the religious culture and how different it is and foreign from what, say, culture is today. Many of these things that are done in the park really show how interpretation can be done to the most perfect level of meeting both getting people involved while at the same time portraying the history in a very, very true and very structured way that meets the authenticity of that time period as best as we can. Now, that being said, there are some things about the park that could be changed, in my opinion, to help meet a wider audience of people. Putting the entire emphasis on starting dialogue on the visitor to the park does have some drawbacks. If someone is a shyer individual who basically just wants to walk around and see things, they're not going to get that full experience. If they don't want to communicate with the interpreters, they aren't going to gather that full experience. They will be able to see all of the materials, all the material culture that's there, and they'll probably get a very good grasp of, what life could be like, but there's so much more information that would be gathered if people interact with the interpreters there. And that is why they are there. And for the Danish public, this interaction might not be such a foreign thing, but as an American in the park, knowing that most of the Danish people spoke English, I didn't have a very hard problem going up to interpreters and speaking to them. But there were several times where language and dialogue was an issue for me, and I figured that I would rather not speak to a certain interpreter because I felt like I would have such a hard time communicating that I wouldn't be able to gather the specifics of what the person was saying based on the language that they were speaking to the people around them. Now, this is probably a fault. This is probably a mistake on my part because most Danish people do speak English, but it's just knowing that a large group of people are sitting around an interpreter being spoke to in Danish, I would not want to go up to an interpreter and ask them a question in English and therefore impede the rest of the learning of the group. That part is something that can't be controlled, and I don't know if it really should be controlled because this is a Danish living museum for basically 4 Danes, and it is something that I think is very special, and it shows how Denmark really goes about the approach of their history with very hands-on, very personal approaches, as opposed to the more static approaches that I think we get here in America. Most of the museums that I visit in America, you walk into a museum, you see the artifacts or whatever's on display behind a glass case. Maybe there is a slight audio recording or audio tour that you can plug into a headset and listen to as you walk through. And sometimes you can walk through with a museum employee who will direct you to the things and give you, historical explanations of them. But this take on a living museum about an entire time period and its material culture displayed in this way, I think reaches a very wider audience, while at the same time it really shows that you can learn a great deal on a subject without having to go through the original, set in stone museum type of structure. I mean, you can have somebody explaining to you exactly how a material process works, and then see it, and then not only see it, but then take part in it. And I think that is something that really helped me gain a lot more information from this type of park, and it really is something that I think is a very effective way to use the interpretation and display of history in this manner to not only reach a wider group of audience, but, do it very effectively. The second to last item or place that we visited that I'd like to talk about is the Hedeby Viking Museum. Now, the Hedeby Viking Museum is located in northern Germany, and it is both a museum and a reenactment part kind of rolled up into one thing. And the museum is a very, very well-done museum with a lot of ways to grab the attention of the visitors to the museum and tell them about the history in very manageable bite-sized pieces from room to room throughout the museum. But the real thing that I thought was really fascinating about this museum was its reenactment park. The reenactment park was located about half a mile away down the tributary that led into the North Atlantic. Now, this, the tributary it led into the Baltic Sea. I take that back. This location of this reenactment park was very, very interesting in that it was incredibly well done, in that the buildings were professionally thatched. The buildings were very meticulously reconstructed in order to show how they actually would have been built. All the materials that were used were historically accurate. But the thing that I found that was most fascinating were the park employees that worked this place were professional reenactors. This is their full-time job for many of them, and they do this for a living. I found that to be very, very interesting. We spoke with one gentleman who was he built ships and he helped woodwork for those, and he was telling us about how he would go through in like the fall months and bring the ships up and work on them for the coming seasons. And it was really fascinating to know that this was his job. And his hobby actually was reenacting a different time period, but his job was reenacting the Viking period. And I found that to be incredibly interesting, that there are opportunities for people who would like to do reenactment for a living. Now, that really stuck with me. Another thing that stuck with me was the material culture that the processes that were being replicated in this recreation of a Viking village were being done by professional reenactors as well. There was some person that was working on carving wooden spoons to, weaving yarn into various items, socks, small bags, purses, those types of things, bone carving. There was a variety of different processes that you could go and see people do. And not only would you go into one of these, period buildings and see this process being made, you would be able to sit down and talk with the reenactor who was doing it. And not only would they tell you about what they were doing, how they were doing it, any discrepancies from modern uses of this item that would have been different back in the day. All of these things, you would talk to these reenactors who were incredibly well versed in the subject matter. And I thought that was very interesting because there were people of all ages at this park, and they were talking like everyone would have something different to ask these interpreters, and they would basically scale the information to the age of the person they were speaking to. And I found that to be incredibly interesting in that it made history very down-to-earth and manageable for the people who would be visiting these centers. And I mean, it was presented in a way that is incredibly historically accurate. I mean, that compiled with the passion and the fact that these interpreters are full-time, this is their job, really made something that was incredibly historically valid in the sense that you got, not only did you get the feeling of the time period, you got very spot-on information about how the processes were constructed, how the items were used, basically how people go about their lives, all these things that you don't really think of when you see somebody just walking down the street wearing period clothing. And you're just like, oh, okay, well, he's dressed like a Viking. Well, that's interesting. But they would tell you like why the clothing is cut a certain way, what it had to do with the weather of the time period, what it had to do with the activities you were doing, how they were implemented, how it was used. And I thought like the fact that people were on hand to tell you about these things and that they were full-time employees was really a very important thing as far as like establishing the validity of the information that these interpreters were telling you. Knowing that this was their job really put a lot more perspective on it as to somebody who was just doing this as a hobby on the weekend. Now, I found that to be very interesting. Now, the last place I would like to talk to you about is the Bornholm Middellander Center. Now, this is on the island of Bornholm in the Baltic Sea. The island is part of Denmark. It is a relatively small island that focuses a lot on agriculture, but has a very strong tourism business. And this Midlander Center is a medieval reenactment park located very close to the center of the island. Now, this park, it has a very interesting purpose and function on the island of Bornholm. The interpreters are there reconstructing various medieval processes, showing people how to do the processes themselves. One of the things that we learned there was how to do a Viking style of finger braiding in order to make cords, belts, bracelets, strings, all these types of things that could be basically made out of smaller, more intricately made rope, with which was used colored dye to make it much more visually appealing. Now, the thing that was very important to the function of the island is that many of the reenactors, well, there are some that are actually employed by the park and this is their job, many of the reenactors are school students who are having either trouble fitting into the school system, say they ran into a little bit of trouble with the law, and they were looking for ways to basically reintegrate into society. And this park gives those people that opportunity. They basically come to the park. They are employed by the park. They have to spend some of them are there for volunteer hours. They learn the processes from the people who work there, and then they spend their time interacting with the public, talking to them, building up social skills that could serve them in various, say, service fields of employment. All of these things, and this acts as a kind of a rehabilitation to get people back into the workforce who primarily just weren't meshing very well with the modern education system in Denmark. Now, I found that to be very interesting because not only does this park provide, the information they provide is accurate, and it is very centered on the medieval time period of Denmark, which is something that we had not seen a lot of on our trip, and I found that to be very interesting because it showed the bridging between the Viking Age and the medieval age, which leads into the pre-industrial age, industrial age, and modern times. And I found that to be a very interesting bridge to see, what technologies were kept around, what styles of architecture were still used, what had gone the way of the dodo and was no longer used. All these things I found to be very interesting looking at this medieval park. But the most important thing in the park was you have these interpreters, some of whom are full-time or seasonal employees that come during the tourist months. But you have this extra social benefit of having a historical reenactment park located in your area. It can be used for a variety of different ways, and for the people who are doing this as a way to basically build social skills to get back into the workforce, not only are they learning history in the process of learning these skills, they're teaching it to other people, to tourists, visitors, or people who just want to know more about medieval Denmark. And I found that to be incredibly important about this place. It was a very structurally important place from the sense of it showed not only how history can be done interpretation-wise, but how it can be done serving the public in more than just educational ways. And I found that to be an incredibly, incredibly important part of our time we spent on the island of Bornholm. Overall, I find a lot of the places that we went to that practice this type of interpretation of history, using interpreters and those variety of displays of material culture, I thought all of them were very, very well done. Even going back to the ones that were more amusement, parky, type Renaissance fair-ish, for lack of a better word, I thought the ways that they were done was still incredibly valid and important to history. And while some of the historical accuracy may be lost in some of the way that things are presented, or even in translation from somebody speaking not maybe their second language, but their third language. Say there was an interpreter that spoke Danish, German, and English as their third language, you might not be able to get an accurate translation. There are many things that we couldn't really take we couldn't really get an entire grasp upon because of because we're American. And I found that all of the places were incredibly well done, and I think that there's a lot of American history that, if presented in this way, would become much more tangible for younger generations and older generations. I think it's something that can be used very successfully to portray history to any age group. I mean, there will always be people who kind of scoff at it and say like, oh, well, people just want to dress up and talk in a funny accent. But if they want to dress up and talk in a period accent, and they're doing it in order to teach people actual historical facts, then I would say that this is a perfectly valid way to portray history, and it must be approached as such. Well, I want to thank you for joining me for this podcast. Hopefully there will be several more podcasts on the various places we visited in Denmark. Again, my name is Ryan Matson, and thank you for listening.